Nothing to lose. The ancient writer Luke records these words in the book of Acts. He says, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything that I want him to do. David is regarded the greatest king in the history of ancient Israel. He is a brave, successful, righteous ruler. However, the storyteller does not neglect telling stories of David's failure, conspiracy, and murder that were also part of his narrative. But one of the most famous stories in the Bible involves David. It is referenced in Western pop culture in many different forms. It's the story of David and Goliath, and it usually refers to a conflict between an underdog and a much more powerful enemy. And this is the story that we're going to focus on today. And it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So we're not going to read through the story today, but I would encourage you to have it open so that you can reference it back and forth as we go through some of the points and talk about some of the characters. So again, that's 1 Samuel chapter 17. The book of 1 Samuel addresses and follows the lives of three main characters: Samuel the prophet, Saul the first king of Israel, and David the second king of Israel, who we're focusing on more today. There are a few key themes that are brought out in the book, and they're actually foreshadowed in a poem in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and we read that earlier in the gathering. And the themes are this: that God opposes the proud, that he exalts the humble, that he is faithful even when we are evil, and the promise of the Messianic King who was going to come. And these themes are poured out through the book, but we also see, as we follow the life of Saul, that he becomes king, rises to power, only to have his character flaws exposed, and he begins this steady descent into madness, while contrasted with David, who is a humble shepherd boy, who God selects, and we see him arcing upwards to become and fulfill the destiny that God has for him. And so the story of David and Goliath is set in this, but it's also set in the context of a greater battle between the armies of the Philistines and the armies of the Israelites. Each army is located on a hillside with a valley between them. And so for 40 days, the two armies are camped across from each other. And every day during that 40 days, Goliath, who is the champion of the Philistine army, comes out and he shouts towards the Israelite line. And this is what he says to them. He says, "Why don't you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. They were dismayed and terrified for a good reason. Goliath measured 6 cubits and a span. If you're doing the math on that, modern day measurement is 9 feet 9 inches. He was massive. In fact, he was so large that they said his armor weighed over 50 kilograms. And so David enters into the story while this is going on. And what had happened was that David's 3 oldest brothers had joined Saul's army and were actually at the battle as members of Saul's army. And so David's father, Jesse, sent David to go visit them and to bring them food and to bring gifts to the king in order just to gain some more information about how his sons were doing and hopefully find them a more preferable spot in the battle where they would be less likely to be slaughtered. And so he witnesses Goliath's challenge. And after he hears Goliath's challenge, he looks around at the different soldiers and he goes, "So who's going to fight him? And what is the reward for fighting this giant? Like, what is the king offering?" And the soldiers tell David, well, he's offering wealth, he's offering the princess, his daughter's hand in marriage, and he's also offering that that person's family will be tax-free forever. And so David's oldest brother, Eliab, hears David asking these questions, and knowing his little brother, knows that his brother is up to something, and he becomes angry with him. And he rips into him. But as this is happening, reports go to the king. And the king hears that there's a soldier who's inquiring about fighting Goliath. And so the king is relieved. Saul thinks, finally, we're going to be delivered. And so he sends for the soldier. And it turns out to be David. David was known to the king at that point. He had served in the king's court a little bit. And he convinces Saul to let him go fight the giant. And so Saul is like, yes, you go fight the giant on our behalf, because nobody else is going to. But take my armor. Dress up as me. And so David goes to put on the armor, and none of it fits at all. In fact, it becomes a liability for him, and so he refuses to take the armor with him. He goes and he selects his weapons of choice, which is a staff and a sling. And so when the giant comes out to challenge the Israelites, David goes to meet him. And the giant is caught a little bit off guard by a boy being sent to do a man's job. And he makes fun of David a little bit. And as the battle begins between the two champions, David takes the stone, loads it in the sling, and fires the sling and has a perfect shot and hits Goliath right in the forehead. And the Bible records that it actually sinks into his head. And so at that, the giant collapses. And David runs forward, grabs the giant's sword, and cuts off his head. And the battle is over. The challenge is over. David has defeated the giant. And so I have some questions for you as we've told the story. I want you to interact in your groups here. Question number 1, give an example of a modern-day David and Goliath matchup. Number 2, have you witnessed this saying in your own life? God exalts the humble and opposes the proud. And number 3, are you facing a David and Goliath type conflict in your own life? Goliath in this story is a menace to the survival of Israel. He is the focus of fear that the Israelite army experienced. And the reaction of some of the main characters teaches us an important lesson. Earlier we read Hannah's song in chapter 2. And the theme foreshadows the rest of the stories in the book. The theme is that God lifts up and works through the humble, but opposes the proud. And so we're going to examine this pattern through 3 characters in the story. We're going to look at Saul, we're going to look at Eliab, David's brother, and we're going to look at David. And so the first thing we're going to look at is the fatal flaw of King Saul. And that was arrogance. Until the previous chapter, the entire book of 1 Samuel had really focused on the rise of Saul from a regular person to be the king. And he had humble beginnings, and he had great success at the beginning, winning many battles and winning the hearts of the people. But then he had made a series of missteps. And we see from the story that God and Samuel had already made plans to remove him from power. In fact, the book of Samuel says this. It's Samuel speaking to Saul. He says, I will not go back with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. And so we get to the story of David and Goliath. And Saul's reaction to Goliath's challenge is unimaginable. It would have been expected that when Goliath the giant comes forward and challenges the army of Israel, that Israel's greatest champion, who at that point would have been regarded as Saul because of his success in previous battles and because of how tall he was, it would have been expected that Saul would have gone to meet the giant. He was the most likely choice. He was the logical choice. That he would step forward to save his people. But instead, he embraces fear and hopes that someone else will come along to rescue them. And see, Saul's arrogance, he was so full of himself that it made him completely reliant on himself. And this led to his downfall because he was never able to trust God with anything that was bigger than Saul himself could handle. And so he always had his faith in himself. And when he couldn't handle it, that's when he failed. The second character we're going to look at is the fatal flaw of Eliab. Eliab was the oldest son of Jesse. He was David's oldest brother. He was a soldier in Saul's army. And as the story goes, when Samuel the prophet was going to anoint the next king of Israel, God sent him to the house of Jesse, and he said, one of Jesse's sons, and there were 8 of them, is going to be the next king. And so when Samuel arrives at the door and says, hi, I'm here to anoint one of your sons as the next king, please bring them to me. Jesse didn't want to waste the prophet's time, and so he chose Eliab, his firstborn. And as soon as Samuel saw Eliab, he was impressed. And the book records it this way. It says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so Eliab was expecting that he was going to be anointed king. He was the logical choice. He was the firstborn. He was the strongest. He was the most kingly in appearance. He was his father's choice. And so when he wasn't chosen, it rocked him. And it started this root of bitterness and this entitlement where he felt like God owed him one. And so when David shows up to the battlefield and he begins to ask questions about fighting the giant, Eliab is angry at David. Not because David is the little brother who's going to get himself hurt and they're all going to get in trouble, but because Eliab was possessed with jealousy and guilt at his own reaction, that he didn't step forward and act bravely. He felt he should have been the chosen one, and because he felt betrayed that he wasn't selected king, his entitlement actually made him bitter instead of brave. And so then we look at the next character, David, and what was his flaw? His flaw was humility. We actually don't see it as a flaw in God's kingdom. It is the way that God's works, and it's the theme of this story and of this book. We see David who trusts God in the moment. He had been anointed the next king of Israel. And the narrative actually tells us when David is anointed as king that he is filled with the Holy Spirit. And we're going to look a little bit more at that next week as we celebrate the day of Pentecost. But he's portrayed as a young, inexperienced shepherd. But his bravery showed the heart of a king. A courageous faith built on faithfulness to God and built on his experiences with wild animals. And a stubbornness to the principle that he was a conduit of God's work. This defined David in his early life, and he did incredible things as a young leader and as a young ruler. Unfortunately, later in his life, he struggled with the same demons that Saul did. And David gave in numerous times. But what defined him over Saul is that David always returned to a posture of humility. And when he returned to that posture of humility before God, God restored him. And so these 3 characters show us 3 different ways that we can respond to trouble. And so if Goliath represents trouble in this story gives us a formula on how to deal with trouble. The first thing that we need to do is identify the trouble that we face. We must take stock of it. David ran out and faced the giant. He faced the trouble. And so if you are feeling like you're just overwhelmed, things are not going right, and you're just wishing it would all go away, unfortunately in life, that doesn't happen. We need to force ourselves to face it, to evaluate what it is, and to be honest about what we're facing. Because that's the only way that we can fight back against it. The next thing that we need to do is trust that God is in control of the situation. This is a posture of humility. Instead of trying to control it and have it work out to our outcomes and our means, we trust that God is in control and that we just follow his lead. And this leads us to the next thing, that we trust God will keep his word to us. And the Bible shares that nothing can separate God's love from us. That doesn't mean we will always be successful in everything we do, but it means that no matter what we do, success or failure, whether we overcome our struggle or whether we consistently battle with it, it's not because God has stopped loving us. God's love is there with us. He is faithful with us each and every step along the way. And so we need to remember his promises for us. And then, as we remember those things, we're pushed into action. And we need to act bravely, doing the things that we are able to do. And this is faith. Faith is not a belief that it'll work out and just hope it works out. Faith is actively putting your efforts, your talents, your time, your treasure, your strength, your character into the situation and trusting that you are working with God through that process. And so as we close, what are the Goliaths in your life right now? I would be shocked if you didn't have some. They come all the time. Even when life seems to be going well for everybody, we do face troubles. Jesus himself said we will have troubles. But you add in a worldwide pandemic. You add in financial difficulties and the collapse of different economic sectors. You add in uncertain futures and planning. And those troubles seem to be magnified, or they are magnified. And so, what are the Goliaths in your life right now? And think about how you normally deal with these troubles. Do you hide and hope for the best? Do you do nothing and become angry or guilty in your inaction? Do you take control of the situation and not seek what God has for you? Or do you face it trusting God and trusting his purposes in it and following his lead? And that's the question that we all need to wrestle with. And so as you face troubles, as you face your struggles, keep in mind what David did and be encouraged by his example. And remember that God is always with you through every struggle and every trouble that you face. Let's pray.